right, perfect. I'll work with you. All right, so CC3, feminist theory. Let's get into it. Next slide, please. All right, brief summary. Carlos Franklin, 35-year-old cis male, half Caucasian, half Ecuadorian, never considered himself as white, despite his father being Caucasian. His mother is from Ecuador and moved to the US to marry her husband. Middle of 3 boys. Mother was loving, but Carlos says was tough. Father expected him to stay in the family industry of banking. His Incan lineage is very important to him, despite his mother not practicing ancestral practices. He says he intuits them from his ancestors himself. Openly pansexual, which his family supports. Divorced from a cis female, most recent relationship with a transgender man. Upper middle class, is a global airlines manager. Bullied in school throughout his high school and middle school years for his weight. Assets, though, he's very open to therapy, extremely motivated to make change, self-sufficient, very spiritual, expressive. His self-reporting struggles include a lack of clarity over his calling, so his life path, his lifestyle, his partner, quote unquote, uncontrollable binge eating, as well as patterns of pushing people away and emotional outbursts, which are only mitigated when he goes traveling. Next slide. Theoretical understanding. 3 core concerns, which we described earlier: confusion over life path. In feminist terms, we can say is a disconnection from his true sources of power, spiritual, somatic, the like. Binge eating would be an assertion of power over his body. So an effort to control it as a capitalist machine, to hustle, an effort to recolonize over and over again. And also this simultaneous nourishing and punishing of the colonized inside. We want to nurture, but I also want to colonize again and again. 3, outbursts in intimate relationships. We could say this for potentially men in general in the patriarch, a lack of access to and also support for emotional authenticity. So in terms of the colonized mentality, the colonizer wants to continuously remonstrate the oppressed inside, while the colonized lack agency and safety in relationships because they lack that in the world. Development of concerns would be pretty much touched upon already. Colonized mentality, alienation, self-denial, ambivalence. Colonization doesn't just create material impacts, but also deep psychological imprints intergenerationally. So cognitive distortions regarding trust and power are now seen in the immediate in his relationships. On the flip side, the colonizer mentality, entitlement, rigidity, aggression are sort of embedded in being a cis male at this point, but you kind of have that amped up when you take into consideration race and colonization across the world. And all of these are to say intersections of identities, run up against norms in the family, the same themes, society, minority stress, machismo, the appearance as a protest of sexuality and commodity, and then ancestral trauma and assimilation, which mother and child experienced. Next slide, please. So what needs to change? Understanding all of that origins of what it means to be a man in this world and why this is happening to him can lead him to a greater self-acceptance, emotional authenticity, integration of the colonizer and colonized mentalities and felt senses, ultimately helping him with his material goals of relational intimacy, eating, and the like. Next slide, please. I wanted to briefly bring in another theory that I have come across in some social work articles by Cindy Blackstock, the breath of life theory based on relational worldview principles. And this really struck me a few weeks ago because Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Maslow actually spent time observing and living with Blackfoot Indians, and he created that initial triangle based on his observations, but he left out a very key component, which is spirituality. So if you look at the second figure, Cross reinterprets Maslow's needs to reflect that, centralizing spirituality before anything else, before love and relationships, before shelter and security. So wanted to make note of that. Next slide, please. And if we look at figure 4, that's another image to sort of describe ancestral knowledge, backwards and forwards, as above, so below. All of these cultural and contextual happenings then impact and redirect and refeed into all these other aspects of life, including interdependent, spiritual, cognitive, emotional relating. Next slide, please. So we all know the goals of feminism, change yourself, change the world, build self-esteem, accept one's body through accepting gender and race roles. Decolonization goals, we may not know that, so a brief run-up would be raising awareness of the colonized mentality, correcting cognitive distortions, context of forms of oppression, affirming, therefore, individual identities and the collective, and so forth. So ultimately, Carlos's goals here in therapy would be to liberate and decolonize. So overcoming those mentalities, as we described, the machismo norms, to take control of his life. And therapeutic stance, of course, egalitarian, embodying vocalization, assertiveness, and potentially either a sister-brother relation or elder. Next slide, please. I wanted to briefly stop at these images by Dr. Jennifer Mullen of decolonizing therapy and Latinx parenting. Particularly the one that pops up the most in the center. How does emotional colonization show up in your life? These might be new questions for you, so let the feelings roll. I've broken generational curses and it's time for generational blessings. Decolonization requires the consent of our ancestors. You've been taught to be obedient, now how to activate healing and therapy. Next slide, please. Key interventions. So I wanted to briefly touch upon feminism versus existentialism and psychoanalytic theories we've discussed before. So existentialism is bad faith, where it says, I am to blame. Well, in feminism, we say the other is, not me, it's them. Heidegger's, this just says mood determines worldview. Feminism says oppression determines ours. And Sartre says, we always had choice. Feminism says we actually didn't, but now we have the choice to change the world. In terms of psychoanalytic theory, we are not repressed, rather we are oppressed. Big difference here. Assessment, it might be helpful for Carlos, being that he's very technical in his job, to also externalize norms through different assessments, but optional. Therapeutic techniques, reframing the struggles, understanding colonization, and an instance of that would be recontextualizing Incan law, like Amasua, Amayula, and Amakea, do not be lazy, do not lie, do not steal. Those were very traditional and almost tyrannical in that time, but if we can reframe those to serve the mentality and uncover those maybe within him already, talking about those colonization narratives, that could be helpful. Behavioral treatment, instead of relaxation or exposure, feminism traditionally says unite and fight. I say, why not both? 2 minutes, thank you. So resting as resistance, all of the NAP ministry. Mindfulness as an action. Your soul is already free. Embodied mujerista practices, Mayan storytelling, folklore drawing as testimonio or story. Like, I want to know your story. Queering the mythic theology of the masculine, like snakes, for instance, could be very powerful and empowering for Carlos. Spirita, spiritual issues require spiritual solutions. So we go back to the source, like consciousness raising groups, so we'll say ceremony. So practices connected to lineage can help Carlos understand his true power, learning from elders, and mitakoya oyasin, which is Native American for all my relations, that interdependence and empathy. Next slide, please. Brief pit stop at the NAP ministry here. Brilliant, Trisha Hersey. Your worth isn't determined by your labor. Reoccupying the body is a political act. I'm not the free help desk. Go dream to receive the downloads. I mean, so powerful. Oh, next slide. We're almost there. Reflection. My personal history as an activist and researcher here just meshes. I love the idea of abolishing notions of psychology in true form. Challenges, mainstream feminism does not examine racism, imperialism, and yet multiculturalism doesn't address women's oppressions. So Alice Walker in 1983 coined womanism to incorporate all of those, but it's still considered an outsider theory, because of racism. So womanist psychology, therefore, is really nascent in academia. All of this to say none of these theories really include men. Not that they should center them, but I believe radical inclusion is next, since we all are working together. Overemphasis on sociological. I like to ask, when do we stop asking the oppressor for understanding? Can we employ ACT, acceptance, and solution-focused frameworks like the miracle question to society? Can we have unconditional regard for the world and our oppressors? I think there's a lot of integration we can do on a lot of different micro and macro levels here. Next slide, please. I wanted to leave you with quotes by Ellen Kashuk. She's a 60s feminist psychoanalyst. We questioned everything about traditional therapies and would not accept any provided truths without scrutiny. We examined all therapy techniques for complicity and oppression. And I was beginning to feel, as were others, that I had to invent the psychology I had been looking for. Very powerful. I think as we move through these theories, we get to know the past and where the psychoanalytic traditions come from, but moving forward in our own practices, the field of our field, we come to create an auto theory, collective theory, and ultimately be the change we wish to see. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Allison. Love all the graphics. You guys are so creative. I'm so very impressed. As a feminist therapist, I want to say, appreciate your passion and activism. Yep. Great.